Is our country a hotbed for corporate corruption? As we focus on this morning, we discuss whether the measures we have in place to help combat graft are actually effective. We're joined by Peter Goss from the Agency for Corporate Governance. Peter, good morning. Thanks for your time this morning. And I suppose just looking at let's reference Transparency International's latest corruption ranking, putting us 71 out of 180 countries. Some might say, well, that's not bad. Others might say we actually should not be on that list at all. Why are we on that list? Why does corporate corruption even exist and thrive in South Africa?
Let's put the Transparency International stats into perspective. They're totally a public sector view. Let's use a better stat. The better stat is the Global Corruption Barometer, which surveys 160,000 people around the world. In that survey, we come in at citizens in general, 160,000 and more in the world, say that corporate corruption, they believe 51% of corporates are corrupt. So it's much more realistic and a proper measure for corporate corruption as the TI-CPI index would be. The average around the world is a third of corruption is ascribed to business. Interestingly enough, a third of corruption is ascribed to government. So in that survey, I'd be always cautious about the TI-CPI and our apparent downward trend in terms of ranking is not an accurate means to measure that too. Our score is what you must measure. The score is 0 to 100. South Africa's score has been a relatively stable 43 to 44 on average out of 100. Now, that's not an exciting score for any country. The average of 120 out of 180 countries in that survey, 120, two-thirds, all measure less than 50 out of 100. So it is a global problem to be somewhat mediocre on the corruption performance, anti-corruption performance level. So we're in that uncomfortable median of under 50%, 50 out of 100. And the highest in the world is 89 out of 100. So nobody's got 100 out of 100 as clean corruption. So we're sitting in the bottom half.
So let's look at specifically in South Africa, and you talk about the third being government, the third being the private sector. What's the overlap between private and public sector corruption? Are we looking at these feeding one another, which becomes also a big problem?
The elementary overlap is to say there's no corruption that happens involving a government official without a business official. But that's common sense. We don't do it that way. Empirical data will tell you differently. What we want to look at is intra-business corruption, business to business. We call it B2B corruption. I think that's the beast that doesn't get attention because we keep having to have a reference point being government. No.
Why doesn't it get that?
Business makes money. The economy comes from business. So in good practice, international good practice, it says business is the bigger problem. Business should lead the anti-corruption discourse. And the reason for that is business does not see corruption as its problem. It sees corruption as somebody else's problem. But international best practice tells you, for example, there's a partnering against corruption initiative led by the World Economic Forum. That initiative is a totally business-led initiative saying, in the world, in multinational transactions, we business leaders don't condone corruption. We fight it without being dragged kicking and screaming to the party by a government.
So should we look at then, Peter, and should we worry that the reason and we've been talking about collusion, like, for example, the bread price fixing scandal, we're looking at construction, which we saw coming out, that was huge after the 2010 World Cup. What are we looking at? Are we looking at these corporates? Are we looking at those companies, for example, the construction companies, saying, hey, government is busy fighting its own battles, there's corruption there, we can easily get away with it because nobody's watching us? Is that the attitude here? Also, that you would expect the one to maybe rat the other one out and say, hey, guess what? That company came to me and said, would you like to be involved? Do you want to sit around a table and talk about how we can all benefit from this? Do we have like-minded people? What is the problem?
We do not have like-minded people seeing that this is our problem as players, role players in a country. The economy revolves around business. Business pays taxes, citizens pay taxes, and citizens work for business. So the power lies in the hands of business, and business is abdicating that responsibility because it's easy to point a finger across the passage. Again, I go back to world-class best practices. I've been studying this quite extensively over the years. Around the world, there's another program called Collective Action, driven by the United Nations Global Compact. It also involves business dragging government kicking and screaming to fight corruption, saying we're all suffering. Business within itself making pledges that we will not be corrupt, so that we don't use corruption as an undue advantage when we deal with each other, not only with government. So we must lift our rhetoric beyond it's about government. It's about business. They hold the power, and business leaders sit on podiums making loud noises through their representative bodies, pointing a finger the other way, talking about, for example, state capture. But they should take responsibility and say, not only is business party to state capture, leave state capture out for as an example. Without state capture, business is busy colluding, corruption cartels, banking fraud that you're seeing all over the place, insurance companies allegedly colluding, recruitment companies colluding. There's no government official involved in that.
So what do we do? What do we do about this? I mean, sometimes when it comes to government, it's easy, and we know we have a very a public that's more aware than it's ever been before about things about corruption when it comes to government, about politics and all of that. What do we do when it comes to pinpointing this in the private sector? Do we boycott? Do we do that kind of thing? Do we know as the public what our rights are and how we can actually address this?
The world's best practices are in Hong Kong. Botswana is losing its place now, but it's been doing very well in anti-corruption efforts as a role model in Africa. The Cape Verde is doing very well in a role model in Africa. India is starting to show signs of being very serious about corruption. What are those signs? 3 key characteristics of measures to manage corruption. One, called preventative vigilance. Within an organization, having programs to mitigate the risk of corruption in your company, anti-corruption compliance programs as one example. The next one is punitive vigilance. In other words, taking action against offenders within the corporate that are involved in underhanded activities, including those grey illicit conducts, what I call related party transactions, which is B2B, business-to-business transactions, conflicts of interest within organizations, and quite prominently exchange of business courtesies under the guise of a business courtesy and facilitation payments, paying people to open doors for them in the business sector. So the second characteristic I mentioned to you is what we call punitive vigilance. The most pronounced characteristic to your question is where society actually gets active, and it's called citizen participation in anti-corruption initiatives. Now, if you look at BRICS, the rest of BRICS, Brazil, India, China, and Russia, as young as some of them might be in the anti-corruption discourse, the one characteristic they have is they have a business sector anti-corruption initiative accountable to the general public. We do not have that. The business sector says, this is not our thing. We just stand on a podium, we call ourselves business representatives, and we scream about the guy on the other side. But we ignore our own intra-business problems.
And what does it say? That we don't have the legislation, we don't have the law in place to actually throw somebody in jail for this. Rather, people get away with fines, and that's okay, and it goes away.
You know, the 52 top disclosure items, which is the #1 means to manage corruption in a business, is through disclosure. It's when you disclose and when you're transparent and when you report that your shareholders, that your citizenry, that the stakeholders at large are able to hold you to account. So people think accountability is about beating somebody up. Accountability is about being as transparent as beyond what the law calls for. Business does not like to be transparent. So if we encourage transparency and disclosure and reporting, 1. 2, we need to also encourage that those who receive the transparency and disclosure, for example, I said to you, the United Nations Conference on Transparency and Disclosure says the worst reported item in 52 disclosure items is the outcomes of auditing results and the outcomes of audit findings from integrated reports. You would think that's the gatekeeper.
Yeah.
The worst performing area is audit transparency.
Well, we saw it
and you can
ourselves.
see it now in the incidents we're seeing, is that business does not reveal, and now it lands with the regulator. Ne? When it lands with the regulator themselves do nothing. It sits in the regulator's shelf. How many reportable irregularities have you heard about in the media right now? People saying organization X, Y, or Z, business or public SOE, being reported, the regulator has it, and where does it go?
Where does it go? All right. Well,
So capacity to follow it through is very light and not serious enough.
wow. Okay, so it's definitely not somebody else's problem. It's all our problem. Thank you very much, Peter Goss from the Agency for Corporate Governance.